Hello, and welcome back to Read Aloud with Dan. That's me. Today on Read Aloud, we'll be discussing background to Vladimir Lenin's The State and Revolution. We're going to be reading the endnotes, which you can find at Marxists.org. We'll be reading from the Wikipedia article, and we'll be reading the very short prefaces to at least the first edition. Beginning with the endnotes. Lenin wrote The State and Revolution in August and September 1917, when he was hiding from persecution of the provisional government. The need for such a theoretical work was as this was mentioned by Lenin in the second half of 1916. It was then that he wrote his note on the Youth International, in which he criticized Bukharin's position. Bukharin pictured here, any moment now. Oh, I can't pull it up. Bukharin's position on the question of the state, and promised, I just got lost, on the question of the state, and promised to write a detailed article on what he thought to be the first Marxist attitude of the state. Here's Bukharin. This guy looks sort of like Trotsky. He says, in a letter to A.M. Kollontai on February the 17th, 1917, he said that he had almost got ready material on that question. This material was written in a small blue-covered notebook headed Marxism on the State. I thought it's Kollontai. I could be confused. In it, Lenin had collected quotations from the works of Marx and Engels and extracts from the books by Kautsky, Panakowick, and Bernstein with his own critical notes, conclusions, and generalizations. Sorry if I got the graphic wrong. Try my best. It's a one-man operation over here. When Lenin left Switzerland for Russia in April 1917, he feared arrest by the provisional government and left the manuscript of Marxism on the State behind, as it would have been destroyed had he been caught. When in hiding after the July events, Lenin wrote in a note, "Entre nous," or between us, "If I am knocked off, I ask you to publish my notebook, Marxism on the State." It got held up in Stockholm. It is bound in a blue cover. All the quotations from Marx and Engels are collected there. Also those from Kautsky against Panakowick. There are a number of remarks, notes, and formulas. I think a week's work would be enough to publish it. I consider it important because not only Plekhanov, but Kautsky too, is confused. When Lenin received his notebook from Stockholm, he used the material he had collected as a basis for his book, The State and Revolution. According to Lenin's plan, The State and Revolution was to have consisted of 7 chapters, but he did not write the 7th, the experience of the Russian revolutions of 1905 and 1917, and only a detailed plan has remained. In a note to the publisher, Lenin wrote that if he was too slow in completing this, the 7th chapter, or should it turn out to be too bulky, the first 6 chapters should be published separately as Book 1. And this is interesting here. Originally, the name F.F. Ivanovsky is shown on the first page of the notebook manuscript as that of the author. Imagine these days we're talking about a guy. Imagine we're not Marxist-Leninists, we're Marxists-Ivanovskyists, right? Imagine that. Lenin intended to publish the book under that pseudonym, otherwise the provisional government would have confiscated it for his name alone. The book, however, was not printed until 1918, when there was no longer any need for the pseudonym. The second edition appeared in 1919. In this revision, Lenin added to Chapter 2 a new section, quote, the presentation of the question by Marx in 1852. This is all sort of assuming you know that what happened in 1917, there was a revolution. It was badass. I thought that was her, but I could be wrong. And now I'd like to go to the Wikipedia article. Not because I trust Wikipedia's especially, but it's a starting place sometimes. And if you'll bear with me, I'm having some technical difficulties, which is always fun. Love that. Okay. Thank you. All right. Turning now to the Wikipedia article. You can see the original cover there. The State and Revolution. It's the cover of the first Russian edition. The full title, you may not know, is The State and Revolution, the Marxist Doctrine of the State and the Tasks of the Proletariat in the Revolution. That's the full title. It's a book, or pamphlet, maybe more accurately, written by Vladimir Lenin, published in 1917. It reads here. Here's Lenin in 1917. I think something big and important must have been going on during this photo. I don't know. It describes his views on the role of the state in society, the necessity of proletarian revolution, and the theoretic inadequacies of social democracy in achieving revolution to establish the dictatorship of the proletariat. Lenin began the composition of an early draft while in exile in Switzerland in 1916 under the title Marxism on the State. As we previously mentioned, Soviets, or legislative bodies of workers and peasants, were the de facto governments of Petrograd and many smaller cities. The Russian public was deeply upset with the continuation of Russia's involvement in World War I and the continued economic difficulties that it brought on. November 7th, the Congress of Soviets officially elected a coalition of Bolsheviks, socialist revolutionaries, and Mensheviks to govern. Through the Red Guards, paramilitary organizations of revolutionary workers, sailors, and soldiers, the Soviet government was able to storm the Winter Palace and officially abolish the provisional government. As is the case with all revolutions, the revolution was not uniformly accepted. That's why the revolution is necessary. So there would be resistance and disruption occurring routinely leading up to the Russian Civil War. A particular issue Lenin covers in The State and Revolution was the right of nations to secession. Specifically, we call it the right to self-determination. And during the composition of the book, the Mensheviks of Georgia declared independence soon after the revolution, forming the Democratic Republic of Georgia. They threw that in there. I guess the Wikipedia editors felt that was important. By November 25th, the 1917 Constitutional Assembly was elected with a majority of positions going to the Socialist Revolutionary Party, which had made a rightward turn after the revolution, with most of the left SRs joining the Bolshevik Party. In one of the most controversial actions of the early Soviet government, the Constitutional Convention was dissolved January 20th, 1918. And here we have a synopsis in which I'm going to have some issues with this Wikipedia article. It says, the State and Revolution, considered to be Lenin's most important work on the state, has been called by Lucio Colletti, quote, Lenin's greatest contribution to political theory. And I don't know. It's a banger and all. I don't want you to think I don't like it, but I don't know. This is coming from an Italian Marxist who would eventually be elected under the same party as Silvio Berlusconi as a member of the lower house of parliament. I don't think Lenin's greatest merit was writing this text. Lenin's greatest merit was bringing Marxism into the epoch of imperialism. That's why we're Marxist-Leninists. The State and Revolution doesn't really, I don't think it represents a new contribution to Marxism, whereas his other works do. What do you think? Sound off in the comments. He says here, according to the Marxologist, and I really do not like that term, David McClellan, pictured here, the book had its origin in Lenin's argument with Bukharin in the summer of 1916 over the existence of the state at the proletarian revolution. Bukharin emphasized the withering aspect, whereas Lenin insisted on the necessity of the state machinery to expropriate the expropriators. Lenin's direct and simple definition of the state is that the state is a special organization of force. It is an organization of violence for the suppression of some social class. Hence his denigration even of parliamentary democracy, which was influenced by what Lenin saw as the recent increase of bureaucratic and military influences. It says here, to decide once every few years which member of the ruling class is to repress and crush the people through parliament. This is the real essence of bourgeois parliamentarism, not only in parliamentary constitutional monarchies, but also in the most democratic republics. Citing Friedrich Engels and Karl Marx, Lenin investigates theoretical questions about the existence of the state after the proletarian revolution, addressing the arguments of anti-authoritarians, anarchists, social democrats, and reformists in describing the progressive stages of societal change. The revolution, establishing the lower stage of communist society, the socialist commune, and the higher stage of communist society that will yield a stable society where personal freedom might be fully expressed. Lenin especially defends Marx's theory of communism and Marxism generally. To wit, when old revolutionaries die, the bourgeoisie are not content with labeling them enemies of the state, because that would attract political radicals, so they attack the revolutionaries' theoretical writings by ascribing to them an anti-revolutionary social democratic mediocrity contrary to the revolutionary nature of Marx. Such bourgeois intellectuals are the revisionists who transform a human being into an abstraction. Quote, during the lifetime of great revolutionaries, the oppressing classes constantly hounded them, received their theories with the most savage malice, the most furious hatred, and the most unscrupulous campaigns of lies and slander. After their deaths, attempts are made to convert them into harmless icons, to canonize them, so to say, and to hallow their names to a certain extent for the consolidation of the oppressed classes, and with the object of duping the latter, while at the same time robbing the revolutionary theory of its substance, blunting its revolutionary edge, and vulgarizing it. Today, the bourgeoisie and the opportunists within the labor movement concur in this doctoring of Marxism. They omit, obscure, or distort the revolutionary side of this theory, its revolutionary soul. They push to the foreground and extol what is or seems acceptable to the bourgeoisie. All the social chauvinists are now Marxists. Don't laugh. And more frequently, German bourgeois scholars, only yesterday specialists in the annihilation of Marxism, are speaking of the national German Marx, who they claim educated the labor unions, which are so splendidly organized for the purpose of waging a predatory war. End quote. The State and Revolution describes the inherent nature of the state as a tool for class oppression. The creation of a social class's desire to control the other social classes when political, economic disputes cannot otherwise be peacefully resolved. Whether a dictatorship or a democracy, the state remains the social control means of the ruling class. Even in a democratic capitalist republic, the ruling class never relinquished political power, maintaining it via the behind-the-scenes control of universal suffrage, an excellent deception that maintains the idealistic conceptions of freedom and democracy. Hence, communist revolution is the sole remedy for such demagogy. 1. The anarchists propose the state's immediate abolishment. They want to push the abolish the state button. But the fucking thing is they've never found it. Lenin counter-proposes that such idealism is pragmatically impossible, because the proletariat would need to crush the bourgeois resistance through a mechanism, and that is the state. It's a tool for oppressing another class. As long as the bourgeoisie is around, we're going to need that tool. And we can't give it to them. 2. Where the state what? He says, were the state immediately abolished, impossible, without the, quote, conditions leading to the arising of the state being abolished as well, a new state would appear. So even if you found some hypothetical abolish the state button, it's going to come back if you don't abolish the conditions under which states arise. What are the conditions? Classes. Oh, so we got to get rid of classes before we get rid of the state. Okay. I'm an anarchist, no more. There it is. That's it. You guys, that's the difference between an anarchist and a Marxist. Oh, that's it. They want to abolish the state. We want to abolish the state too. But they don't seem to understand that you have to get rid of classes first. They don't get it. It's because they don't have a class analysis. It's not rooted in class. It doesn't mean that they can't get things right every now and then. It doesn't mean that they can't do cool things and help and do mutual aid and stuff and resist fascism. It doesn't mean they can't do those things. In fact, those are the best things they do. I wish they'd focus on those things. Anyways. So, reading on, we say, in the event the proletariat, through the dictatorship of the proletariat, would establish a communal state, then gradually suppress the dissenting bourgeoisie in achieving the withering away of the state as its institutions begin to, quote, lose their political character. That's it. Thus, following Marx's conclusions on the Paris Commune, which Lenin took as his model, Lenin declared that the task of the revolution was to smash the state. Although for a period under communism, quote, there remains for a time not only bourgeois right, but even the bourgeois state without the bourgeoisie. All right, I don't love that quote. Why are we sticking that in there? Whatever. Lenin believed that after a successful proletarian revolution, the state not only begun to wither, but was in an advanced condition of decomposition. And that's all that I'm going to read today from the Wikipedia. Now I'd like to read the preface to the first edition as soon as I can find it. There we are. Prefaces. There's a preface to the first edition, and then there's the preface to the second edition that we're going to read here today. Preface to the first edition. The question of the state. Ooh. Bear with me. The question of the state is now acquiring particular importance, both in theory and in practical politics. The imperialist war, World War I, has immensely accelerated and intensified the process of monopoly capitalism into state monopoly capitalism, the monstrous oppression of the working people by the state, which is merging more and more with all-powerful capitalist associations, is becoming increasingly monstrous. The advanced countries, we mean their hinterland, are becoming military convict prisons for the workers. Hinterland is one of those German words, in meaning land in back of, or areas far from cities and towns. You know, the sticks, the boonies, etc. The unprecedented horrors and miseries of the protracted war are making the people's position unbearable and increasing their anger. The world proletarian revolution is clearly maturing. The question of its relation to the state is acquiring practical importance. So he's saying this is why it's important. And before I read this next a paragraph here, I want to tell you about two terms: opportunism and chauvinism. Opportunism in Marxist circles, being an opportunist is a bad thing. Opportunism is a system of political opinions with no direction, no clear path, and or no coherent viewpoint, focusing on whatever actions or decisions might be beneficial for the opportunist in the short term. And chauvinism, and I'm pulling both these definitions from the curriculum of the Basic Principles of Marxism-Leninism, translated by Lun and Wang. Chauvinism is the practice of discriminatory superiority against a group, usually against certain groups of peoples. It often stems from reactionaries who attempt to blame every single contradiction of capitalism on those groups in order to further divide the proletariat. Furthermore, it rises as material conditions decline, or as a result of crisis when the bourgeoisie attempt to foster class peace to divert the proletariat away from class struggle. Chauvinism. Lenin says here, the elements of opportunism that accumulated over the decades of comparatively peaceful development have given rise to the trend of social chauvinism, which first dominated the official socialist parties throughout the world. This trend, socialism and words and chauvinism in deeds, and he names here Plekhanov, Potrasov, Brashkovskaya, Rubanovich, and in slightly veiled form, Tsereteli, Chernov and company in Russia, Scheidemann, Legian, David and others in Germany, Ronaldo, Guesde, and Van der Velde in France and Belgium, Heidmann and the Fabians in England, etc., etc. Again, he says, this trend, socialism in words and chauvinism in deeds, is conspicuous for the base. Servile adaptation of the, quote, leaders of socialism to the interests not only of their national bourgeoisie, but of their state. For the majority of the so-called great powers have long been exploiting and enslaving a whole number of small and weak nations. And the imperialist war is a war for the division and redivision of this kind of booty. The struggle to free the working people from the influence of the bourgeoisie in general, and of the imperialist bourgeoisie in particular, is impossible without a struggle against opportunist prejudices concerning the state. Realizing here my screen is frozen, but what I'd really like to do is just reread that sentence. The struggle to free the working people from the influence of the bourgeoisie in general and of the imperialist struggle. We'll do that again. I just want to get a good clip of this, so I'm going to say it again. Thanks for bearing with me. I'm a fucking idiot. Sorry. The struggle to free the working people from the influence of the bourgeoisie in general, and of the imperialist bourgeoisie in particular, is impossible without a struggle against opportunist prejudices concerning the state. He wrote this in 1917. It's still relevant today. This is still the fight that we're fighting against the imperialist bourgeoisie and thus against the opportunists. We're still fighting it today. It's still relevant. Please read Lenin. So he says, first of all, we examined the theory of Marx and Engels, pictured here together, and I don't think I've ever seen a picture of them together. I think this is a real photo. We examine the theory of Marx and Engels of the state and dwell in particular detail on those aspects of this theory which are ignored or have been distorted by the opportunists. Then we deal specially with the one who is chiefly responsible for these distortions, Karl Kautsky, the best-known leader of the Second International, 1889 to 1914, which has met with such miserable bankruptcy in the present war. Lastly, we sum up the main results of the experience of the Russian revolutions of 1905 and particularly of 1917. Apparently, the latter is now, in early August 1917, the writing of this preface, completing the first stage of its development. But this revolution as a whole can only be understood as a link in a chain of socialist proletarian revolutions being caused by the imperialist war. The question of the relation of the socialist proletarian revolution to the state, therefore, is acquiring not only practical political importance, but also the significance of a most urgent problem of the day. The problem of explaining to the masses that what they will have to do before long to free themselves from capitalist tyranny. And the author wrote that in August of 1917, just months before the October/November Revolution. And the preface to the second edition is not especially lengthy. It reads, the present second edition is published virtually unaltered, except that section 3 has been added to chapter 2. The author, December 17th, 1918. So he's basking in his post-revolutionary glow. Let's go. You love to see it. All right. I think that's enough background for the state and revolution, which we will continue reading next time. If you're watching the live stream, stick around. If you're watching the replay, check out the first section, or chapter 1, Class, Society, and the State. If you like this communist media, help me keep it alive. Love your face.